In December 2001, Enron Corporation was the seventh largest company in America by revenue. For 6 consecutive years, Fortune magazine had named it the most innovative company in the United States. Its stock had peaked at $90 a share. 20,000 people worked there, many of whom had invested their entire retirement savings into the company they believed in. Within weeks, the stock was worth less than $1. 20,000 people lost their jobs. Billions in pensions vanished overnight. And the executives who ran it had seen it coming for years. So here's how Enron became the most powerful energy company in America, what it actually was underneath, and why it remains the defining corporate fraud of the modern era. Taking a look back, Enron was not built on nothing. Kenneth Lay founded the company in 1985 through the merger of 2 natural gas pipeline companies, Houston Natural Gas and InterNorth. He was a PhD economist. He genuinely believed that deregulated energy markets would lower prices for ordinary Americans. And he spent years lobbying Washington to make that happen. Now, I would never argue that what Lay eventually allowed to happen is defensible. But there's no doubt that, in the beginning, Enron was solving a real problem. Before deregulation, energy prices were set by the government. Lay's argument was that competition would drive costs down and reward innovation. For a while, he was right. In fact, some would even argue that Enron's early vision for energy trading, turning electricity and natural gas into freely tradable commodities, was one of the most genuinely transformative ideas in the history of American business. Jeffrey Skilling, the McKinsey consultant Lay hired in the early 1990s, was considered one of the sharpest financial minds of his generation. He had a plan. And for most of the 1990s, that plan appeared to be working spectacularly. The idea behind Enron's transformation was inspired by the deregulation wave sweeping American markets in the early 1990s. Originally a pipeline company moving gas from point A to point B, Enron reinvented itself as a trader, an intermediary matching energy buyers with energy sellers, and taking a cut of every deal. Under Skilling's direction, Enron built what it called the gas bank. Producers deposited gas, customers made withdrawals. Enron sat in the middle, managing risk, setting prices, and collecting fees. By the mid-1990s, Enron dominated the market for natural gas contracts in a way that no single company had dominated an energy market before. And then it expanded into electricity, into broadband, into water, into weather derivatives. Meaning you could literally buy a financial instrument that paid out if the temperature in Chicago in January was higher than average. Enron was creating entirely new markets out of thin air. By 2000, Enron reported revenues of $111 billion. Its stock sat at $90.75 a share. It employed 20,000 people across 40 countries. Ken Lay had the private phone numbers of the president, the vice president, and the Federal Reserve chairman. And everything under the sun appeared to be thriving. Fortune named Enron the most innovative company in America for 5 years in a row. Analysts called it a model for the 21st century corporation. There was just one problem. None of the profits were real. You see, Skilling had introduced a method of accounting to Enron in the early 1990s called mark-to-market. The idea was legitimate in theory. Instead of booking revenue when cash was actually received, you could estimate the future value of a long-term contract and book that projected profit today. In practice, it meant Enron could sign a 20-year energy contract and immediately declare hundreds of millions of dollars in profit, even if not a single dollar had yet changed hands. As you would guess, this created a problem. If the deal later performed worse than projected, the gap between the numbers on paper and the cash in the bank grew wider. And Enron's deals, particularly its international projects, were performing far worse than projected. To manage that gap, CFO Andrew Fastow began constructing a network of off-the-books partnerships as far back as November 1997. He named them after Star Wars characters: Jedi, Chuko, LJM. These were shell companies designed to absorb Enron's failing assets and bad debt, keeping them invisible on the company's official financial statements. These guys were determined to maintain the illusion of growth at any cost, and had no intention of disclosing the reality to shareholders. And this attitude became extremely apparent in February 2001, when Fortune published an article describing Enron as a largely impenetrable company that was piling on debt while keeping Wall Street in the dark. The stock was still trading above $80. Analysts were still recommending it as a buy. And yet, behind the scenes, the gap between Enron's reported finances and its actual finances had grown to billions of dollars. Then, on August 14, 2001, Jeffrey Skilling resigned. He had been CEO for less than a year. Ken Lay stepped back in, held a conference call with stock analysts, and said, "And I want you to remember what he knew at this point." He said, "I never felt better about the company." He knew what was underneath it. Not only did Skilling's resignation not reassure the market, it actually accelerated the scrutiny Enron had spent years avoiding. But by October 2001, things were different. On October 16th, Enron reported a third-quarter loss of $618 million and quietly announced a $1.2 billion reduction in shareholder equity tied to the Fasto partnerships. The SEC opened a formal investigation 6 days later. And just as the investigation was beginning, Arthur Andersen, one of the 5 largest accounting firms in the world, and Enron's auditor, instructed its employees to destroy all documents related to the Enron account. Boxes of evidence were shredded, hard drives were wiped. Meanwhile, from August through October, Ken Lay personally sold over 18,000 shares of Enron stock. He simultaneously sent company-wide emails encouraging employees to buy more. Employee retirement accounts, heavily loaded with Enron stock, were administratively locked during the precise weeks the stock collapsed. A scheduled changeover meant workers could not sell, even if they wanted to. Statistically, the executives who knew the most sold the most. By the end of November, the stock had fallen from $90 to less than $1. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for bankruptcy. The thing is, what happened next tells you almost as much as the fraud itself. 20,000 employees lost their jobs. Combined, they lost $1.2 billion in retirement savings. Savings that had been almost entirely invested in Enron stock that the executives running the company had already sold. Ken Lay, the man who had pocketed $217 million in stock profits while those workers held theirs, died of a heart attack in July 2006 before he could be sentenced. Jeffrey Skilling was sentenced to 24 years in prison. He was released in 2019 and is currently back working in the energy industry. Andrew Fasto, the architect of the shell company network that made the whole fraud possible, was sentenced to 6 years. He is now a public speaker on business ethics. That is not a joke. Arthur Andersen, one of the most prestigious accounting firms in the world for 89 years, ceased to exist. So, what actually happened at Enron? A company built on a genuinely interesting idea that energy markets should be free and competitive, used that idea as cover to construct one of the most elaborate systems of financial deception in corporate history. The real damage wasn't the $74 billion in total losses. It was that 20,000 ordinary people, workers who were told by the people running their company that everything was fine, lost not just their jobs, but the retirements they'd spent decades building. And the executives who told them that had already cashed out. The question worth sitting with is this: if the people closest to Enron, the analysts, the auditors, the board, either couldn't see the fraud or chose not to look, what does that tell us about who financial markets are actually designed to protect? Drop that in the comments. Drop a like if you've ever held a stock longer than you should have because someone told you the company was fine. And consider subscribing. We cover the biggest corporate rises and falls in recent history every week.